So let's now make sure that we load the data we store here on Firebase into our application, into our website here, when we load this starting page. Because at the moment here in the All Meetups page, we're still using this dummy data, and that's of course not the goal. Now to load data from our backend, from our API, we need to send a HTTP request again, just as we send one when we store data. So in the all meetups JS file, in the all meetups page component, we want to send a request. The question is, when do we want to send the request? And the answer is whenever this component is being rendered. So whenever we visit this page. So what you could do, what could be your first idea, is that directly in this component function, before we return the JSX code, we can fetch our data. We can use the same URL as we used for storing the data, since we want to fetch data from the same API and node. And hence we can use the same URL here. Now we don't need to configure this request here with this second argument, because the default is that a GET request is sent, and that's exactly the kind of request we need here. We want to send a request to get our data. So we can call fetch just like this, and this will fetch this data. But now, unlike as with the post request, when we send data, now when we get data, we are definitely also interested in the response. Now, since fetch returns a promise, we can of course use the then method here and chain this after then to handle this response. So we pass an anonymous function to then, and here we'll get the response object as an argument automatically, because that's how the fetch function works. It returns a promise which resolves to the actual response at some point in time. Now from that response, we want to read the body, we want to read the data, and we can do that with the JSON method. That's a method which exists on this response object out of the box, and this will give us access to that data automatically converted from JSON to a plain JavaScript object. But here's a gotcha. JSON will actually return a promise as well, so we also need to wait for this promise to resolve. So I actually will return response JSON here and add another then block where we then get the actual data. And it's now in this second then block where we can work on that data. We could also add error handling, and we do that in the complete guide course, but for the moment here, let's focus on just getting that data and using that data. So here in this then block, we get the data. What do we want to do with this data now? In the end, we want to extract an array of meetups from that response data and pass that as a value to the meetups prop on the meetup list. Now we'll have a problem here though. Since fetch returns a promise, and we're in this promise chain, JavaScript does not wait for this promise to complete before we return here. Now you could think that we can use async await here to wait until this is done, but that would be bad, because that would mean that the entire component function now returns a promise, because that's what the async keyword does. It converts this function to a function that returns a promise, and that then no longer qualifies as a valid React component, because React component functions must be synchronous and must not return a promise, but instead they have to directly return JSX. So we can't use async await here. Hence, we can't defer returning a value until we have a response. Instead, what we need to do is we need to return some temporary JSX code, for example, a loading spinner or something like this. And then once we have the response, we want to update the returned JSX code. And how do we change what's visible on the screen? With state. That's what we learned earlier already. We can use state to change what's displayed on the screen when certain conditions change. Before, we did that when the user clicked a button and we wanted to show an overlay. Now I want to change the state once we have response data. So for that here, in this all meetups.js file, we can import use state from React, so this use state hook, and then register some state here with use state. And here we could, for example, set up some loading state. So name the constant loading or is loading and add a set is loading state updating function, because you learned that use state always returns an array with exactly 2 elements, where the first element is the current state snapshot and the second element is a function for updating the state. And when we have data, we want to set is loading to false again because we're not loading anymore. But actually the initial state here should be true, not false. So we start in a loading state and then we set it to false once we have the data. And then with that, we could check if we are loading here in the component function before we return. I check if we are loading. And if we are, then I want to return another piece of JSX code where I, for example, have a section with a paragraph where I say loading, something like this. So that's my fallback content, which I want to return in this component whilst we are loading. And we only return the actual meetup list if we're done loading, so if we have the data. But speaking of that, there we're missing an important point. At the moment we're just managing the loading state, we're not doing anything with the actual data that is being fetched. For this, we could add another state to this component. And that is something we haven't done before, but you can have multiple pieces of state in one and the same component, as many as you need. There is no restriction here. And this could be our array of meetups. And it could be an empty array initially, but eventually we want to override this once we fetched our data from the backend, from the API. So here I'll name this loaded meetups and set loaded meetups. And here we want to set loaded meetups to data, let's say. That will not be the final step, but for the moment we can do it like this. And then we could pass the loaded meetups instead of the dummy data to our meetups prop down there. And that means that now we can also get rid of that dummy data. So I will delete this dummy data constant. Now don't save this file yet though, because this code will cause an infinite loop. What's the problem here? The problem is related to state and our HTTP request. You might recall that I mentioned when I introduced state that when we call this state updating function, we tell React that it should re-execute this component function and re-evaluate it, and then return the updated JSX code. That's the idea of state. It allows us to re-evaluate a component and possibly render different content on the screen whenever state changes. The problem here is that we change state once we made our request. We changed the loading and the loaded meetup state. Then this component function will execute again. What does this mean? It means that this fetch function will run again, and we send another request. And once that's done, we update the state again, which means the component function executes again and fetch is called again, and so on and so on. So we have an infinite loop, and that breaks our application and spams our API with requests, and it's not something we want. How can we prevent this?